You officially done your gauge swatch and you're just about to go on, you kind of measure it and you're like, it's 2 stitches off. Think that'll be okay? I want you to stop. I know that we always get the fear put inside of us by designers saying you have to do a gauge swatch, and it's like, but it takes time out and it's just so frustrating to do. But one thing I want to tell you, and what we're going to talk about today, is why a gauge swatch is so important, what a gauge swatch is, and why if you don't actually get the right stitch count, it might dramatically change the size of your actual garment. So first of all, what is a gauge swatch? And a gauge swatch is essentially a tension square. We all knit differently. Some people are tighter knitters, some people are looser knitters. It really just depends on your tension. And sometimes your tension can change depending on if you have a stressful day or whatnot. But I want you to imagine a 10mm needle. Technically, this means that our stitch should be 10mm high and 10mm wide. But depending on how some people really tug their yarn or some people really loosely wrap it and then take it off, that can change it not being a 10 by 10mm stitch anymore. It can be slightly different. It just means that we have different tensions. So when you're looking at the designer, all they're telling you is, hey, this is a tension that I have to be able to get this piece to work out exactly as the measurements are in the finished measurements. You just need to hit the same gauge swatch. Let's break it down a little bit further. So like, why is a gauge swatch important? And it's mainly because when a designer is making an item, let's say a garment especially, they're using their gauge swatch, which is a 4" by 4" tension swatch, to be able to determine the stitch count for the other sizes. So essentially what ends up happening is that if you don't get the stitch count and you're maybe like 2 stitches off, that starts to compound on the other ones. So the easiest way to explain is that for a designer, if you're going by the Craft Yarn Council standards, essentially every single size is the difference of 4 inches. And a gauge swatch is also 4 inches. So it's like every single size that I'm thinking as a designer, I'm adding essentially a 4" or a gauge swatch of fabric. So if you're not getting that exact same size, that can change the actual outcome of your finished measurements. Let's go through an example. Let's say that a designer wants 40 inches in a circumference of their finished garment. That would mean that they would have to cast on the same amount of stitches for 10 gauge swatches to essentially make 40 inches across. Because again, 4 inches by 10 gauge swatches equals 40. Now, let's say that their gauge is 16 stitches per 4 inches, which means that that is 4 stitches per 1 inch. Let's say that you got 14 stitches. Again, 2, it seems so close, but 2, when we're actually looking at that 4 stitches per inch, now you've taken off ½ an inch. And when we use that 10 gauge swatches, all of a sudden you are essentially adding 2 more inches per every single 10 of those, which now means that your size is an additional 5 inches. And you didn't mean to do that, but because you didn't adjust your gauge to make sure that it was the same stitch count, you now have 5 additional inches, which is the very big difference of a pattern fitting or not. And the same thing when it goes to the opposite. Let's say that you have 18 stitches instead of 16. Again, it's 2 stitches. It seems like it's nothing, but we again realize that that means that you are losing ½ an inch for every single one of those gauge swatches going around. And you've now lost 5 inches in ease, meaning that your finished dimensions aren't 40 anymore, they're 35. That could be the difference of something fitting really well or literally negative ease. So I know that you just want to look at those gauge swatches and think, it's only 2 stitches, it's not gonna make a big of a difference, but it actually will. So let's go quickly through those 2 scenarios that I just gave you and actually talk about what they mean. So let's say that you get 14 stitches instead of 16, which means that you're actually getting less stitches in the 4 by 4 inch gauge swatch. So what that means is that your stitches are actually too big. They are taking up more space in that 4 inches of that measurement, which means that your stitches are actually too wide. That means that we actually need to bump down a needle size and re-gauge again, just to be able to, again, try and make sure that we're getting to those 16 stitches. We already talked about it. Those 2 stitches can really make or break your piece. Now let's go in the opposite way. We were originally talking and saying that you got 18 stitches instead of 16. This means that you have too many stitches that are fitting into that 4-inch increment, which means that your stitches are actually too small. You can fit more of them in, which means that they're too thin, and you actually need to bulk up the size of those needles, which means that you should technically be going up a needle size and re-gauging and trying it again. So essentially, if you end up having too many stitches, it means that your stitches are too small. You need to bump up. If you have fewer stitches, it means that your stitches are too big and you need to bump down a needle size. Okay, so you've made your gauge swatch and you realize that you were 2 stitches off. Before you start to redo your gauge swatch, I want you to double check a few things. One, did you block your gauge? So all of the gauge swatches that you're going to see in our pattern are blocked. So whether you are going to wet block, steam block, mist block, whatever it is to your finished item, you want to also do that to your actual swatch as well. So you might not realize, but your yarn may bloom. So essentially, if you end up having it where you have 18 stitches and it's fitting too many, you don't know if it touches water and it might expand. You don't know if it's going to essentially like get bigger. And I will say that when you block things, things normally go from smaller to bigger. So it might actually be beneficial to just make sure that you have blocked your gauge swatch before you actually move on, because you might actually already have it prepped and ready, but you haven't blocked it. So you don't know that it actually is going to get to that gauge. Another thing to think of is that you actually want to make sure that it is being knit in the correct way. So if you end up seeing that it needs to, the gauge is 16 stitches by 20 rows in the round, you need to make sure that you are knitting that piece, that gauge swatch, in the round, because when you are knitting flat, and let's say it's stockinette, you're going to knit 1 row, then you're going to purl 1 row. But when you actually knit in the round, you're only going to knit. You're never going to do purls. And purls actually have a different tension than a knit does. So you want to make sure that you are actually knitting it however the piece is going to be made. Usually in the pattern, it's going to tell you the actual construction method. So you want to make sure that you are blocking it like that. The last thing you want to do is make sure that you are actually getting the full stitch count. I will find that if you are sometimes trying to like fit it in, or maybe you've cast on the exact same amount of stitches that you were told to, those edges can really warp. Like we're seeing these ones getting really pulled in. So I want to make sure that it is 4 inches across plus some extra so that I can actually make sure that I am taking the measurements of stitches that are not warped. I personally love doing a gauge ruler that is 4 by 4, so you can literally place it down. But again, when you are doing your gauge swatch, I would suggest adding a few more extra stitches on either side and then doing more rows, just because again, those edges can really warp. Sometimes depending on how you're binding off or casting on, sometimes they can be tighter, so it might warp your piece. So just keep that in mind. You'll notice that the entire time that I've been talking about this, I've really been talking about stitch count over your row count. And that's mainly because it is so much easier to be able to adjust the rows and take out length, add length, than it is to be able to add additional width. Some things that you might need to have your row gauge be a little bit more accurate is going to be raglans, because again, you're making those increases in a certain amount of time, and you want to make sure that that arm depth is exactly the same, or say that you're doing a drop shoulder and it needs to have this many rows to be able to make sure that it's not too long or too short. You may need to fudge with the actual math on your pattern in that case, but don't worry, it's a lot easier to be able to adjust that math than it is to be able to do the actual sizes in width. I hope that gave you a little bit more information about why it's so important to be able to gauge swatch, especially thinking, oh, it's only 2 stitches across, it should be fine. I really, really do suggest making sure that you do a gauge swatch, cast on those extra stitches, do those extra rows, make sure that you're actually doing it in the correct method that the pattern calls for. Make sure that you're blocking your gauge swatch as well as you're going to finish for your blocked pattern or garment in the long run, because it really does start to add up. And again, gauge swatching is mainly just a tension swatch. It's to be able to make sure that your stitches are the same sizes as the designer's, because that means that you're actually going to get the finished measurements that the designer originally intended. So I hope that helped. Make sure that you are liking, following, and subscribing my YouTube channel if you really enjoyed this, and I will see you in the next video.